And yet I watched Jesus walk through life as a man who always risked being taken advantage of, but refused to back shelf the goodness of his Father. The church runs that risk. It's a risk the church should have known we were signing up for. Our first allegiance is not to try and govern ourselves as we've watched our nation govern itself or watched our businesses govern themselves. Our first allegiance should be, how does our founder govern himself? How does Jesus respond in the world? How does Jesus move through the world? You've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. I say love your enemy. Bless those that curse you. Do good to those that hate you. Pray for those that spitefully use you and persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. In other words, you're going to know you're his sons when you start living like your dad. Listen, you don't become sons when you live like your dad. You're already the son, but you start to know you're your father's son when stuff your dad said starts to come out of your mouth. Have you ever noticed that? You remember that moment in your life where you went, oh my gosh, I sound like my... Or somebody says to you, you just sounded like your mom. You go, and your whole life you're like, I'm never going to be that. And then you are. You sound like your dad, don't you? You know why? You've heard that enough, it starts to come out in who you are. That's us watching Jesus. Watch Jesus so much that we start to love like Jesus, respond like Jesus, act like Jesus, live like Jesus, be like Jesus. It's the danger in replacing Jesus with our favorite ministry or our favorite minister, because we start to preach like them, act like them, talk like them, walk like them, and they're fallible and they're fleshly, and they're going to sometimes put their allegiance into the wrong kingdom. But Jesus, if we watch him work, and I don't just mean we watch him invisibly, we sit and meditate on him. I mean, we watch him work in the Gospels. We watch how he deals with this world and its system and its society. Then we'll be over what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. Dietrich Bonhoeffer called it cheap grace because it was a grace you could privatize. It was a grace you could have, but not let it affect you in this world. You could be a part of the system and still have that grace. 90% of the Christians in Germany joined the Nazi Party at the beginning of what would ultimately be World War II. 90% of the Christians in Germany. Why? Because the allegiance they had to the Christianity that they knew was wrapped up in the pride of party and country. And nothing could break that. And it was only years later that we realized the tragedy. They didn't realize the tragedy they were walking into. And I fear for the gospel of Jesus Christ in America, that does what it can to wrap itself in policy, or wrap itself in leadership, or wrap itself on the left side of the aisle or the right side of the aisle, or even thinking that superior religion is the middle part of the aisle. And the reality is that the kingdom doesn't have an aisle in the building. It doesn't have an idea it shares with the world. It's Jesus speaking logos into the darkness and into the chaos. It's the lion as a slain lamb with a sword in his mouth that divides the asunder of soul and spirit and joints and marrow, not at the end of a violent move, but at the end of a revelatory move, where Jesus speaks so clearly into our hearts that it changes what we are and who we are. Matthew chapter 10, there we are. The one I tried to take you to, but verse 34. Oh boy, I struggled with this verse for a while. Do not think I came to bring peace on the earth. I didn't come to bring peace but a sword. Where does Jesus carry his sword? In his hand or his mouth? In his mouth. If you see Jesus with the sword in his hand, then this next verse gives you the authority for violence through the lens of the world. But if you see Jesus with the sword in his mouth, then this word gives you the authority of tongue. You realize you have an authority as one of the sons of God that comes from what you say about your enemy, what you say about your loved one, what you say about your neighbor, what you say about yourself, what you say about your heaven. That's his sword. I've come to set a man against his father. The word set there is better translated alienate. I want you to think about this. I have come to alienate a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. What's Jesus talking about? Well, we do know that Jesus is speaking in a Jewish world. The book of Matthew is very focused on Israel in that last hour. Jesus is speaking in a world in which if you were to accept Jesus as the coming Messiah, your national heritage was going to turn on you. Your Jewish grandfather wasn't going to have anything to do with you. Your good Abraham following mother was not going to welcome you at the table. You had betrayed the faith of your fathers. And Jesus said, that's a sword, not in your hand but in your mouth, that sets at variance. I think the old King James says, sets at variance father and son, mother and daughter. But that word alienate to me is powerful. It's Jesus' way of saying this. If a man accepts me, he becomes an alien in his own country. He becomes an alien in his own culture. Because I am so opposite of the way you trained yourself to respond that it is as if you are from another dimension. You know how John described the love of God? He said, what manner of love is this? Do you know what that word is in the Greek? What country is this love from? The early church looked at the love of God as from another dimension and the people of God as aliens in a world that did not understand them. You say, how are we going to spread the kingdom on the earth? We're going to love like Jesus. We're going to love like Jesus. Our religious pushback is going to be, there's got to be exceptions to the rule. We don't have to treat everybody that way, do we? And that's the same pushback Jesus got when he said, love your neighbor as yourself. And a guy raised his hand and said, hey, who's my neighbor? You know why you would ever ask who my neighbor is? Because you're trying to figure out who you can hate. You're trying to figure out who you can marginalize. You're trying to figure out who you can leave out. You're trying to figure out who could get your fist, not your word. And Jesus gives you a story. And at the end of the story, what you realize is your neighbor is going to be the last guy you want it to be. And it's going to be the first guy you wish it wasn't. And that's the point. Go love your neighbor. Guys, we're in a world that's on fire. They're burning. They're mad. They're angry. It's time for the kingdom to show up. Time for the kingdom to show up.